2, 3, 4.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the Power of Music Thinking. My name is Christoph Zürn, and this is the podcast for people with a musical heart and a wicked job. We're looking for stories, insights and tools from the big world of music to inspire leaders and followers to listen, tune, play and perform in whatever field you're operating. Today we're in Canada and talking to Adrian Cho, ex-IBM consultant, book author, wildlife photographer, artistic director of the Ottawa Jazz Orchestra, bass player and creative director of SyncSpace. We talk about how a damaged muscle brought Adrian to the piano and later to software development and IT consulting. He shares with us how jazz thinking can influence innovation and help embrace the unknown so that exciting things can happen. And we discuss the essence of how people work meaningful together, how people deal with adversity in teams and what this means for team development. And we talk about his new endeavor, SyncSpace, and why audiences on this platform tip 4 to 6 times more than they already have paid. All right, welcome to the Power of Music Thinking, and welcome, Adrian.
Thank you very much, Christoph. It's a pleasure to be here speaking with you.
Adrian, to start, what was your first concert or performance, or maybe just a sonic experience that had an impact on you?
Well, I began singing in a boys' choir. A choir came around to the school, and that was sort of like, it wasn't a professional choir, but it was quite a serious choir, young boys, and they were auditioning, and they came to the primary school that I was in at the time. So I think I was maybe 8 at the time. And we had auditions, and then I ended up in this choir. And then I remember we had our first performance, and we were singing Christmas carols.
Oh.
And we had to hold these candles while we were singing. We had a candle and just had like a little piece of cardboard around the base of the candle because the wax is dripping down, just to make sure that the wax doesn't go on your hands. Yeah. But somehow I remember when I was singing, I'm not sure how, the wax ended up going on my hands, and it gave me a bit of a scare. That whole experience of making music with other people and performing for other people, in a way, when you're doing it as part of an ensemble and you're not as exposed, right, and your voice is hopefully blending with other voices, it's not, you don't necessarily, you hopefully don't get as nervous, but still it's a very exhilarating thing, and then just sort of the experience of bringing joy to people and just seeing them smile and seeing them hearing them applaud, it's just a wonderful thing. So yeah, that's a long time ago.
Wow. Sounds good. And I really can picture seeing you standing there with a candle and and the experience of eventually the wax going on somewhere.
Yes.
Great. Adrian, you have a very rich CV. And maybe you just introduce yourself. Who are you and what do you do for a living? And then we can go step by step and how this all connects.
Yeah. Well, so for most of my professional life, I guess sort of since I left school, maybe I should even go back. So the thing is that throughout most of my life since maybe I was a teenager, I started music, as I said, sort of at 8. And then after I was singing, I played piano, and then later on I played trumpet. And now I'm a double bassist or a contrabassist. And then at some point, I think it was in my early teens, I started playing around with computers. And eventually, one of the things that was interesting is I left school and I went to university, and I was going to do a Bachelor of Music Education to become a music teacher. And And I realized pretty quickly this was going to be a very hard life financially. It was going to be very tough. And actually, one of the things that happened to me that was a little bit disastrous at the time was that I was hoping to be a professional trumpet player. And in my final year of school, I actually blew out the muscles around the lips here, what they call the embouchure is the shape that you make with your lips. And I found that over time I was not able to maintain the embouchure. It would start to fatigue and fail. And eventually I could only play like 10 minutes at a time. And I went to a neurologist or a neurosurgeon, and I asked eventually this, once I got to a specialist and asked him what was going on, and he said, well, you basically damaged the muscles and you have to stop playing. And I said, for how long? He said it could be for a very long time. And it was actually a disaster. I thought my life was sort of almost over, right? Because that was what I wanted to do. And so I ended up having to go to the conservatorium playing piano, which is really only a secondary instrument for me. So anyway, I did my first year of this Bachelor of Music Education, and then I decided, this is going to be pretty tough, and there's no reason why I can't do music at a professional level and earn, money from music without necessarily having to rely on it full time. So I decided to go into software development, into IT. And so that's what I ended up doing professionally for over 30 years. And throughout all that time, I tried to do music whenever I could, which in some cases turned out to be very hard just because of the time that I was spending on my day job. And so there was actually a period of about 10 years in which I did very little music. But then actually since I was born in Australia. I grew up in Australia, and I came to Canada, where I am now, when I was about 30. And so this is about 20 years ago. And when I came here, this is actually when I took up the double bass, the contrabass, and I also started leading bands and producing shows and doing lots of other things. So I was doing all of that while I was in tech. And then a few years ago, I decided to leave tech, and I decided to do something which is totally different to any of these other things that I've talked about, which is to become a wildlife photographer. I had taken up photography at some point, and I really loved wildlife photography and the idea of being out in nature and trying to use photography to make people more aware of nature and climate change and so many things that we're struggling with. And then because of the pandemic, that actually threw all of that for a loop. So I ended up having to pivot, and then I ended up doing something that I'm doing now, that I'm spending 100% of my time on now, which I never really thought I was going to do, which is I started this company called SyncSpace.live, which is a platform to allow musicians to perform together over the internet at a professional level. The service is aimed at professional musicians, and in fact I used the platform to run a virtual venue, which is now on a mid-year break, but for the first 6 months of this year I presented over 60 concerts. And so these are ticketed concerts. Actually in August I am doing 2 shows. I'm actually doing 1 show tomorrow night, that has been fairly interesting. So that's where I am today. And that's funny because I ended up then using both my musical skills and my technological skills, which it was pretty much an accident, really. I never had any plans to do this. It's just that when the pandemic started, none of us, we couldn't perform together anymore, right? Because of social distancing. And so, that's where I am today.
Sounds like a logical synthesis of all your skills and experience. Let's talk about SyncSpace a little bit later, more about it. But you've been also a consultant for IBM for many years.
I worked for many big companies and many small companies, and small companies trying to become big companies, and big companies trying to be smaller and more agile, like IBM and Bosch and other companies like that. Procter and Gamble, big corporations who are trying to become faster and more agile. And so, I've been very big on the idea of agility and execution. And I ended up, because I at some point I started to identify these parallels, right, which you know very well about, between music and other activities, and because I felt I had a lot to say about this, or perhaps people were asking me things and I felt like I was repeating myself all the time, I thought I'll just write a book about it. And so I wrote a book called The Jazz Process in 2010, and that book was primarily about what jazz musicians do and how it relates to other fields, and how the activities that people, the things that people do in other fields are often very similar in the way that they interact. And so it's mostly about teamwork, really. It's mostly about how people work together, and how they deal with adversity, right, and deal with change, and they deal with chaos and so forth.
Yeah, and to use jazz as a process. So that's the name of the book.
Yes.
The jazz process.
Yes.
There's a quote from Bill Evans. I'm sure you know. He's talking about, I feel that jazz is not so much a style as a process of making music, and that's connected to how can you co-create? How can you use that? What often we say, let's improvise, but as a matter of fact, that's that's just getting rid of the problems because the plan didn't work. But
Right.
in the jazz process, that's totally different. It's a real way of looking to something, a mindset.
Yeah, and part of that mindset is that you actually embrace change. You actually embrace unknown. In fact, you try to introduce unknown things into the performance or into the environment because exciting things could come out of that. Of course, it's also risky and perhaps scary for some people, right? But the whole jazz thing is fairly interesting, right? Because when you ask people what is jazz, they have lots of ideas about what it is, but there's two words, one is improvisation, right? And another word is innovation, right? And those things end up being quite sort of similar, right, in terms of the actual processes that go on, because typically when jazz musicians are, for example, improvising a solo, they're trying to come up with something unique to say, right? They're trying to come, and that's often what we're trying to do when we're innovating in technology, is we're trying to come up with a unique problem to a unique solution to a problem.
Yeah, and in that respect, there's also one thing that comes up often is how do you scale this? Because you're also a conductor of the Ottawa Jazz Orchestra, right?
Yes.
So, and how big is the orchestra?
Well, and that's one thing that's interesting, is that the orchestra is not even a standard size. I mean, when we play in a big band format, it's 15 or 16 people. We've had as many as 30, 40, 50 people on stage. We change the ensemble depending on what we're doing and what instrumentation is required. Sometimes we've just had like a whole string orchestra and a saxophone player and a rhythm section. But yeah, sometimes it's, 20, 30, 40 people.
Yeah. So I think that's interesting because in smaller teams, that's very close to jazz, and everybody is acting and improvising, listening. And when you scale it up, the probability that there must be some score is much bigger, and people improvise more in a, like you just said, or in the solo, but not
Right.
everybody's improvising
Yes.
at the same time. And I like this analogy to help sometimes people in business to let them feel on one part what this could mean, and on the other side they also want to have absolutely control, which there is not all the time.
Yes, yeah, and yeah. So the scalability, the scaling part of it has always been of great interest to me, and that's why I mentioned that when I worked for some of these companies, like every company generally wants to grow. That's the sort of the impetus in businesses, right? Is to always keep growing and get bigger and make more money and so forth, right? And things happen. There are transformations that happen as you grow, and things become harder. and for many reasons. So typically, companies, when they're small, they're a lot more agile, right? And they're a lot more innovative, and so it's fairly interesting to see what happens, right, as companies scale, and then where they get to the point where they realize, we've lost something. How do we get it back, right? How do we get back that thing that we had 20, 30 years ago, right? And it's really fascinating, right? I mean, you take a company like Bosch. I did a bit of work with them, and they have a whole unit within the company, and the company is huge. I mean, there's hundreds of thousands of employees worldwide. They have a unit in their company that has existed for decades, and that unit, that the purpose of that unit is to try to help keep the company agile, right? To try and figure out what are the processes and so forth, right? So yeah, it's a fascinating field.
Oh, that's interesting because I couldn't imagine very quickly the analogy to music. So just to turn it around, not always do the analogy from music to business,
Right,
but
yes.
to take your example of that company of Bosch and what would this mean for music, so that you have a small team that looks for innovation, for agility.
Yeah, well, and in fact, in a lot of companies, there is, for example, like the office of the CTO or the Chief Technology Officer in a lot of companies is classically an office that is small, and it does a lot of research and forward thinking and testing and prototyping and stuff like that, and then tries to feed that back into the sort of the mainstream of the organization. But they're typically dealing with technology. One thing I think that's always interesting is that if you think about, companies have products or services, but if you also think about the company itself, the organization as a product, right, which needs to be improved all the time, and you need to fix bugs and all of these things, right? That's a whole that you have to invest. And you can see already the companies that don't invest in those things, that don't invest in culture and don't invest in the processes and so forth, that down the track that they're going to be in trouble.
Yeah, at the very end, they get a problem.
Yeah.
I see this on 3 levels of experiences. So there's one is the product service experience. So that is when you use the product from a company. The other one would be the brand experience, to understand where does this company stand for, and does the thing they do, what they say, and the product I use, does this fit together? And the third one, actually, what you also just is the organizational experience. How is it to work inside the company and with the company? And also to understand how the inside goes to the outside, and try to understand people, so to have these 3 experiences connected. That makes, in my opinion, a strong company.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting too that you're using the word experience, right? Which I think now over the past decade or 2 decades, people have come to understand a lot more now, that experiences are the things that really matter. It's not the product or the people. It's ultimately the experiences of the customer, the experiences of the employees, and so forth, right? And that's interesting too, even in a sort of a jazz or a music performance context, right? Because when you get up there on stage, it doesn't really matter in the end what process you use, right? And even if the methods you use are unorthodox, all that matters is the audience enjoying it, right? Are the musicians enjoying it, right? Will people want to do it again? Will they want to come back, right? Will they want to tell other people about it, right? And we see the success of companies like Apple and other companies that at one point realized, okay, yeah, this is all about the experience. It's not about specifications or numbers or anything like that, right?
Yeah, these are the good examples, and even like Apple, they're also changing because they're getting so big that the experience that you might have had with Apple 10 years ago might change totally, because it's a different business, as well. Let's talk about ThinkSpace, your new project. Oh no, is it a project? Your new, how do you call it?
That's a good question. Yeah, I mean, it is a project in one sense. It's also it turned out it had to be a company. I had to run it as a business, which it's funny because along the way I distinctly remember at a few points saying to my wife, I really don't want to do this. Like I really don't want to. I said I really don't want to run servers all around the world. I remember saying that. I said, I just want to do something to help some musicians sort of in my town or maybe in my province or maybe in Canada. The thing just kept growing. And I really don't know where it's going to end. But one thing I am conscious of is having sort of been through all of these things, working for large organizations and talking about the scalability, right, is I really am very conscious of the scaling aspect. In other words, to me, there's a point at which I don't want it to grow like beyond that point, right? And what that point is, I'm not sure. Right now, it's clear there's a lot of growth because I'm the only person. The whole thing is me, right? And that is definitely difficult when you're at that point. But I don't really want to, at least in my mind right now, I don't want to have 100 people or 1,000 people working in the company. I also don't actually even want to have 10,000 customers, right? I really want to focus on having a smaller number of customers, and it's fulfilling now. And I think customers find it fulfilling that when they when they need help, they're talking to me directly, right? Yeah. Now, of course, that's not necessarily scalable, and if I get sick or something like that, then we have some problems, right? But the experience of it right now is generally pretty good for everyone, and I want to keep that quality level as much as I can.
So that's the quality focus.
Yeah.
And if you would grow, you would be rather a manager instead of the one who's caring for all the details. Maybe it's good to explain what you exactly do, because I think we can learn a lot from music and also a lot from everything that's related to music. So 10 years ago, many people went to Sweden to learn from Spotify how they are organized. Big banks all over the world, they flew there. They wanted to understand what's a chapter and what's a tribe and how does this work.
Yes.
And now we're in the times where we speak much more via like a like a square to each other instead of face to face, and we have meetings and quality time together. And I think there's really in the sweet spot of what you're doing on another level, on the musical level, something that I think we could learn. So maybe you can explain what exactly you're doing with SyncSpace and what you're doing different compared to other services.
Sure. Yeah, so just to sort of get it out of the way in terms of what it is, right? As I mentioned earlier, it's a way for musicians to play together online through the internet, and the core technology for doing these kinds of things, to send the video and to send the audio fast enough that you could play together. A lot of that stuff has actually been around for many, many, many years, but it was never really aimed at a professional audience. And professionals never really took it seriously. It was always just for friends, amateur musicians to jam together and just play together. And usually the experience was not fantastic, right? And so my goal was to take that and to make it good enough that professional musicians would want to use it and that they could put on performances that would be good enough that audiences would really love it and that they would pay money and that they would not only pay for tickets, that they would tip. And that's what's happening at the concerts that I'm running. The audiences tip, and they tip very well, right? So
they pay and they tip.
Yeah, they pay and they tip a lot, like compared to how much they pay for their ticket, like 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, 6 times what they paid for their ticket, right?
Wow. So let me ask. So if you have a concert, it's 1 hour more or less?
That's right. It's typically about an hour. Yeah.
An hour?
Yes.
And you would charge $15?
That's right. Yeah, roughly.
And then after that, people tip?
Yeah, like $50.
Wow.
Sometimes people tip $100.
That's interesting.
And this is not just one time. I mean, there are people who come every week to shows and they will tip like this, right? Hopefully that is appreciation for the talent and appreciation for the medium and the platform and and the way that we're presenting it. So that's what it is, and then the experience of it is so interesting. Right. Mm-hmm. So, firstly, let's talk about the experience from the artist or the musician's perspective. So, you are online, very much like you and I are now, or a lot of us are today when we're using things like Zoom or Teams or anything like that. We can see each other and we can hear each other. The difference is that the fidelity of the audio is excellent. And we can all speak together or play music together at the same time. We can all make sound at the same time, which in most of these systems you can't do that. And the latency or the delay between when I make a sound and when someone hears that sound is very, very small. So small that in the best case it actually sounds like you're right next to one another in the same room. And you can't use typical meeting systems like Zoom to play music like that, right? And so what happens then is we've now had musicians who are playing concerts together who have never even met in person and probably would never have met if not for the platform, right? And then we also have, and so that then allows us to present interesting combinations of musicians that audiences might never otherwise have gotten to hear. And then for the audiences, I think it's very interesting because firstly, they get a really up-close experience, very intimate experience with every musician because, the camera is up close. It's typically like a webcam on a computer, right? Mm-hmm. And the sound quality is excellent and it's very high quality. And so because you might wonder, well, how could the sound be better than, say, in-person experience? Well, it often can be because often in an in-person experience, if you're in a venue sometimes where there's crowd noise and everyone's talking, if you're at the back of the room, right, or if the acoustics in the room are not very good, it can actually be terrible, right, in a live in-person setting. So the audience gets to experience something that's very intimate and up close, and they get to hear and see things that they don't often get to hear or see in person. Like they get to hear the musicians talking about the tunes between each tune. They say, oh, how are we going to do this tune? How fast we do? Oh, no, maybe we should do it, faster or whatever, right? And you don't necessarily always get to hear that, right? And you get to see everything up close. And if you're sort of interested in say, instrument technique, what the guitarist is doing with their fingers and all that, you can see all that stuff happening. And so it's a very interesting experience. And I don't like it. Like every medium, it has its pros and cons, right? It's different to an in-person experience. And so what is interesting is in the beginning, we did this because we had to. We had no choice because there was no other way for us to make music together. And then we were thinking, okay, well, once the pandemic is over, we won't need this anymore, right? But it turns out that the performance experience is a very interesting and unique thing. And also the other thing that's been amazing is we discovered how incredibly efficient we can be in terms of time and money with rehearsals because we don't have to travel anywhere. And especially if you're a musician that plays harp or drums or anything that takes a lot of effort to cart around, to transport around, and to set up and tear down, you don't have to do any of that now. And you can actually just get online, perform, rehearse with one band or one ensemble, and then just switch to the next room and start rehearsing with another group, right? And so that's incredible in terms of saving time and money, And for example, I've got a group right now that is doing some testing, and they are a musical theatre group. They do these like Broadway productions, and they normally fly the cast in for rehearsals way before the show actually starts the performances, and that costs a lot of money to do that, right? So if they can just rehearse from their homes, in different parts of the country, in the US in this case, that's a huge time saver. So yeah, it's we're still discovering. I'm still discovering so much about this, and of course we don't know what the future holds, right, with the pandemic. And but I really do think that it is, and I think the musicians who have been involved in it have discovered that it really is. It's turned out to be something more than we thought it was going to be. We thought it was just going to be like a temporary thing, but I think it'll live on in various forms. Just like I think many of us already know, and many of us are already in situations in our workplaces where some companies have said we're never going back to the office in some cases, right? Or some of them said maybe we will go back to the office, but we'll be doing a lot more things virtually.
Yeah. It reminds me a little bit to the beginning of our conversation about improvisation. So first you use it because you have a problem and you want to fix it. So you just take all these new tools, and when you don't need it anymore because the main problem changed, then you stay with it and you try to elaborate and you work on the real benefits. So then the medium gets really something new, like you just mentioned.
Yeah, well, and even when the thing that you did was a mistake, right, or something that was totally unplanned, and that even happens in music sometimes. I mean, you play something, or you go to try to play something, and you fumble, and it doesn't come out the way you expected it, and then you go, oh wow, actually that's pretty good, I like that, or another musician actually responds back and repeats the thing or something, right, and then all of a sudden now it is a thing, right? Now it's an intentional, positive thing, even though it wasn't planned, right?
I can imagine if someone is listening now to our talk, they also think, hey, well, if this is such high quality, why don't we have a comparable high quality with our meetings? And maybe it's also good to share how exactly you do it, because you rehearse, you direct different things, and you're also using different ways how to and more than one camera, right?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things there. One is that we, firstly, in terms of everyone who is connected to the system, like the musicians, we demand a sort of a minimum level of connectivity and equipment, right? Just like for us to do this recording here, right, you said to me, make sure you're connected by Ethernet, right? I say the same thing with my service. No, Wi-Fi absolutely will not work. It's not acceptable, right? And yes, in some cases, Wi-Fi can be okay if you're standing right next to the Wi-Fi router and nothing else sort of interferes and so forth, right? And I often say that, Wi-Fi is okay until it's not okay. It's like you're going along and the sound seems fine, and all of a sudden you hear or something, right? And so, you have to have a little bit of equipment, like a USB audio interface to get the sound in and out of your computer, and a good microphone and other things like that, right? And it's interesting because, people who, a lot of people are in these Zoom meetings now, and sometimes, the quality, the audio and the video quality is terrible. And it's not necessarily the service, it's because just their setup is terrible, right? And they're on Wi-Fi and their router is in their basement of their house, right? And everyone else is on the internet using stuff, right? And it's overloading the the bandwidth and so forth, right? So one is sort of the equipment, but the other thing that you alluded to is that one of the things I really wanted when I designed this system was that what I discovered, like I think many musicians discovered during the pandemic, is when we had to start live streaming from our homes, typically as solo acts, or if we were fortunate enough to live with another musician, we could perform with them and perform maybe as a duo. It was overwhelming to try to perform music and deal with all this technology, right, that we have to deal with live streaming. And I went through all of that, right? And I had, disasters happen and things not go well, and it's very distracting. And so one of the things that I wanted was, with my service, is that when you're online and you're performing, that there is someone who is in the space with you, who is behind the scenes. And so I typically am playing that role when I've been broadcasting these shows, like the one I'm broadcasting tomorrow night at singspace.live. And so when the musicians are performing, I can hear them and they can hear me, and I can actually make it so that they can hear me but the audience can't hear me. So I can say something to them and they'll hear it in their headphones. So we can see and hear each other, and I'm also controlling all of their audio, the mix of their audio and the mix of their cameras, what the audience sees. So, I'm basically running the studio behind the scenes, and I'm putting, the song titles up and the names of the artists and stuff like that, so that they don't have to do any of that, right? So firstly, I'm there to try to make the quality, to raise the quality, but also they don't have to worry about it, and they can just focus on performing, right? And I thought that was really important, and that mirrors what you would have in an in-person experience. In many cases, you go to a hall, and there is an engineer there who is doing sound and everything else, right? And setting everything up, right? And helping you.
Yeah, it also sounds like a TV live director,
Yeah.
where you have the different cameras coming in, and you decide where or what detail you show.
Yeah, and one thing about that I've discovered, and I didn't really, this was totally an accident too, I actually realized how my experience as a musician helped me do a better job with that. I'm not just randomly switching cameras, right? I mean, I have an idea of what's going to happen with the music, and so I'm sort of like a little bit ahead, right, of what's going to happen. And like often after the, say in jazz, a lot of times when the musicians start trading, if they start trading fours or trading eights, I know that that's going to happen, and so then I'm ready to go to switch to the drummer or something, right? Because I know that's what's going to happen. And so I try to do it in a musical way to support that. And I think that's another thing, is that the musicians have really appreciated that, right? Having someone who's a musician actually working that stuff.
This also sounds like musicians would easier pick up new technology and bring people together, even in an online situation.
The technology part of this has been interesting, because another reason why I think there was never any success with this before at this level is there is a lot of stuff that you have to deal with, both software and hardware. It's not a lot, but it's the level of familiarity and even love for technology, right, with musicians varies a lot, right? And you've got some who play electronic instruments, and they're very familiar with the stuff, and they work with computers all the time. And then there are some musicians who they don't even know much about microphones, right?
Yeah.
They've never mic'd their instrument before, and if they ever did it, they just had an engineer do everything for them, and they didn't have to worry about anything, right? So everyone has had to learn, right, a little bit, and we even just discovered so many things about reliability. And because when you're performing live online, if stuff happens, right, well, we're going to feel the impact of that, right? And so even just the smallest things of computer reliability, like with USB hubs failing and stuff like that, right? Like we discovered these things, right? And it's how important it is to have backup systems, right?
Yeah. So if I compare some meetings, and people just try to switch on like they would open a door and walk through it, but it's much more, and the learning part. So I really try to imagine or try to understand why some people are not capable in understanding what they actually should do. And I can also, I have a lot of empathy with people. You just mentioned the harp, for example. I don't know how many microphones you have to use to really capture everything that the harp player is doing. But at the very end, if it's a performance, you have to be as good in that performance. And if it's just a meeting or if it's a concert, more or less I see a lot of analogies.
Yeah, well, the thing is that when you have a concert and people have paid money to hear that concert, if something goes wrong, right, that's not good. Now, but here's something else that is interesting, and here's what I found. So during the pandemic, my wife is also a musician, and we started doing live streaming, and we had some of these technological disasters, some things that went wrong. And at one point, my wife said, "Okay, we're not doing this live thing anymore," right? And so we actually tried doing some pre-recording, and on YouTube they do these things called premieres, where you upload it and you play it at a scheduled time, and it sort of seems like it's live, but it's not actually live, right?
Yeah.
But our audience told us they want the live thing, even, with warts and all, even if stuff goes wrong, because that's part of the experience, right? And so even when stuff does go wrong, and obviously you don't want it going wrong all the time, but for the rare occasions that it does happen, it's actually interesting for the audience to sort of see what is going on and how do we deal with it, just in the same way as, how do we deal with, other unknown things that happen within the music, right?
Yeah.
So that's been an interesting experience. But yes, definitely. And of course, it depends on how important the performance is. I remember, for example, when I was in tech, that if we had a very important keynote speech or something at a conference, you showed up with 2 laptops and you ran the slides, the PowerPoint or whatever on 2 laptops in parallel, right? Just in case one of them crashed, right? You have to think about these things, right? If it's something that's fairly important, right? And of course, these things can happen in an in-person music performance too. I mean, you can break a string on your violin, right? Or anything can happen, right? And so if it's a very, very, very important performance, you're going to bring a second violin with you, right?
Or you need someone who can help you very quickly.
Yes,
so
that's right.
I think there are videos like, I don't know, John Mayer or B.B. King while playing and just changing the guitar strings.
That's right.
So,
yeah.
I even can, I remember I was at the Berlin Philharmonic and everyone was, and I was backstage and there was a violin soloist, and standing backstage, and the people were already clapping. His string lose some tension, and he was so little panic. And then the first violinist took the violin and just tuned it for him, and I thought, wow, how can you be so. The mix between empathy, practicality, and also on the spot. That was a performance too, and that's really nice when you work with people that have also a lot of experience and also know their instrument even when it doesn't work.
Yeah, and you know what? That story is very interesting too, because it reminds me of something that I learned in tech, right? And that is, when I was managing projects with a lot of people, with hundreds of people, and when there are things that are going wrong. When you have one of those days when like everything just seems to be going wrong, right? And you have many people who are involved, and if you're the leader or one of the leaders on the project, if you get upset and you lose your cool, right? It really is not a helpful thing, because everyone feels that, right? And what people really, really want in a lot of cases, they want someone who is going to, calm things down and come up with a plan and say, and lead people out of the chaos, right? And so that's something I learned, at some point, and I thought, okay, that's a really important thing, right? Like, I have to make sure. And so that's one of the things that I think I've been successful as a band leader, because I always tried to have that, right? And people liked working with me because I was always just relaxed and I made it fun, right? And even and to me, one of the things that was important is that even if we made little mistakes in the music, it didn't really matter. And you know what? Those things were like, they're gone in an instant, right? No one is remembering it, right? Especially if it's not even being recorded, right? But if everyone is smiling on stage and having fun, the audience, that's infectious, right? And the audience loves seeing the musicians having fun, and they're smiling too, right? But if you get everyone all tensed up, right, and trying to, and that's one of the things that, we would often do in the Ottawa Jazz Orchestra. We would do things that were very, very difficult sometimes with not enough rehearsal sometimes, right? Mm-hmm. Because we were dealing with sort of lack of money to be able to pay musicians enough, and so we got very good at trying to, figure out how do we use our time in the rehearsals efficiently and work on the things. And some things you just have to say, that's good enough, right? And that's I think a really important point too. And I think a lot of companies are really realizing that now in tech, in that when you try to make decisions, sometimes you've just got to say, you know what, you're never going to be 100% sure. You're 70% sure, that's good enough, right? Yes, there's a 30% chance you might get it wrong, right? But, the cost of not making a decision could be a lot higher, right? So let's just go with this, right? And, that's interesting when you play live on stage. because there's no luxury of stopping and saying to the audience, hold on, wait a minute. We just realized something that we didn't know before, and we've got to figure it out. No, you've got to keep going, right?
Yeah.
And just work with what you have, right? And that's improvising, right? That's what improvising means, to come up with a solution even when you are not ready, even when you didn't even expect the thing to happen, but you've got to do it. And the interesting thing is that everybody actually does that in their life, right? We all do that in some form, whether it's as parents or as teachers or anything else, right? We all are improvising in various ways.
My question would be, how can you learn, and as you just mentioned, how can you learn not losing your cool in situations? Or is this trainable? Is this learnable?
Yeah, well, I think it's just in the same way that, because people say, how can you practice improvisation? Well, you can, because jazz musicians and other musicians who improvise, they practice improvisation all the time, right? And there are sort of exercises for it. But in the same way, so as an example, Amazon, runs this platform that we now know as Amazon Web Services, AWS,
Yep.
And they have this thing that sort of became quite famous in the industry called Chaos Monkey, which is some software that they ran, which basically throws spanners or wrenches in the works deliberately, like shuts down whole servers or shuts down whole data centers, right? To try to throw some chaos in there so that the systems can be resilient, so you can build resilience into the system so that they can cope with those kinds of failures, right? And so, the only way to really to get good at this stuff is to go through it, right? Is to deal with those bad things. And hey, let's see what happens if we just pull the plug on this computer, which is supposed to be a critical, system, right? I think if you are, that's the thing that when we're all younger and we think we know everything, right? And we don't really understand the benefit of experience, right? But the experiences of going through, it's like they say, what doesn't kill you makes you tougher or stronger, right? Because you learn from all of those failures and fumbles and missteps and things that were unexpected, and you take all of that, I think, and then you try you first of all you become more resilient, and you figure out what are the things that are important, like maintaining your cool and trying to sort of keep that positive environment for other people.
Yeah, there are different aspects to it. One, it's that makes us all human. So we will make a mistake some way or the other. And another one that's a little bit hidden about the professional music: know your instrument, or even know your instruments. And if I have to be online now, for what reason, I really have to master that instrument too. And some people didn't ask for this, but that's essential. And I think when you have sessions and one of the people or the participants is the weak part, but the weak part only on the technical side, that's a problem for everyone. So it's not just you could for the same thing you could rather have someone who's not on that level but technically very good, instead of that you have one person with a lot of quality and it doesn't come through.
Yes, yeah, and so I've been dealing with that in various forms, and in fact, inevitably, in most ensembles, there is someone who's going to be the least familiar with technology, and is going to be having more trouble than other people, right? And I do a lot of one-on-one, with people, getting online with them and walking them through stuff, and in some cases, even walking them through Computer 101 stuff that's got nothing to do with my service, right? So it's got to use with, deal with using their computer, So we're living in a new time, right, where everyone is having to learn because, yes, for what we're doing online now, technology is an important thing. And, what's been interesting too is even a lot of the things to do with my service, and you can sort of see this if you read some of the stuff on the website. Even when I say to people, or people say to me, okay, so I understand, Adrian, that I need a very good internet connection, like a fast internet connection. And they'll say, I've got 100 megabit download or something. Is that fast enough? And then I have to explain to them, well, actually, that's bandwidth, that's download bandwidth. It's actually one of the least important things. The thing that I actually care about is latency, is the time that it takes to send the data from one point to another, right? And that's a thing that the internet companies never talk about. Right. Yeah. So we're learning all of these little things, even about the things that we already had, that we used to measure in one way, and turns out that that's actually not an important thing, right, for what we're trying to do. It's other things that we actually have to measure. And then when we find out that the latency is too high, then we have to go to the internet company and, et cetera, et cetera, So, yeah, I mean, we're learning all the time.
And it's also a little bit about the gear. So because the latency also has to do with the preamp or...
Yeah, there's two parts to it, right? So when, for example, when I'm making the sound now and you're hearing it, right, there's sort of two basic things. One is that there's, like, the delay is that there's some network delay, the transmission time that it takes to send the data, but then there's also audio processing delay on my end and your end, right, that it takes for my sound to go into my system and convert it to digital, and then on the other end for you to convert it back to analog for you to hear it. And yes, if you have some equipment, for example, like with my service, I always want people to be using a USB audio interface, which is a small box, typically like maybe $100, and you plug a microphone into that and you plug that into the computer. USB microphones, for example, they don't work very well. And so some people will say to me, I've got like a XYZ, microphone, USB microphone, will that work? And it turns out that microphone, which they thought was fairly good and works for their Zoom meetings for speaking, is actually very high latency. Yeah. And is actually not very good for this kind of thing, right? As we find out, for example, someone got a microphone and it's a condenser microphone, which is very, very sensitive, normally used in a studio environment. It picks up everything in the room. And so now I hear their computer fan, I hear their fridge, I hear like all this stuff, right? Which is not what we want, right? Again, more learning.
What would be is there a tip, or let's say for the business world, what they could learn from musicians in these times? And you just mentioned a lot. Yeah, so is there one golden thing that you say, maybe just hire musicians because they might have more experience in handling equipment?
Yeah, so I think the thing that what musicians can offer, right, and not just musicians but other performance artists, right, is it's performing, right? Like, people who are performers, they understand, obviously, because that's what they do for a living, right? And here's the interesting thing. So what's happened in the pandemic? We are now all like performing on Zoom, right? And these systems, and we're all broadcasting, right? We're all having to learn how to do these things, and people are learning, oh, geez, I need some better lighting, and I need to do these things to set up my camera so that it's not looking up at my face, right? And all these other things, right? And but as part of performing, there are so many things that need to happen, and one of the things you said before is knowing your instrument, right? And one of the things that's interesting is when you're on stage and you're performing, if you are not very proficient at your instrument, whether it's technology or your musical instrument or anything else, if you're having to spend 100% of your brain CPU thinking about every little thing, where you're going to put your fingers on the instrument, all that stuff, you now have 0% left to interact with the other people in the ensemble, to read what the audience is how they're reacting, all these other things, right? Let alone to then, recognize when there's a problem, something failed or something didn't go well, and how you're going to fix it, right? So, that proficiency with technique means that there's a lot of things that when we're proficient at them, we can do them on autopilot. We don't even have to think about them, right? And many of us have things like that because we've done them so many times and we're so proficient at them. But that what that does is it allows us to then spend the rest of that time not just doing nothing, but actually hopefully using it in a positive way and using it to read what's going on. And so as an example, like when you look at companies that are just not engaged with their audiences or their customers and are not reading what, what's happening, how the customers are feeling, right? Like you wonder, what is going on? Now, part of it could be because the technique and all the other technical things that are going on are overwhelming them, right? And they don't have any CPU in the organization left to focus on that, to be aware of that other stuff. So I mean, one of the things I wrote about in my book a lot, and I talk about a lot, is about awareness, right? That's one of the most important things, right? And if you look at awareness, there's, individual awareness, and we can look at team awareness, and we can look at organizational awareness and environmental awareness. I mean, it's at so many levels. And, when we go through even our day-to-day lives, you encounter people all the time who you think, okay, that person is not very self-aware. Even when you're driving, you're driving down the highway and you're behind some person, and the person has their indicator flashing. But they're going in a straight line. There's nowhere to turn. And it's just like flashing for like 20 minutes. And the person has no clue, right? And you wonder, okay, like this person is not aware. Are they distracted? What's going on, right? And so, we see this all the time at so many levels. I wonder, I know that this is a long answer to this, but I wonder if you're aware of like Colonel John Boyd and the sort of the whole OODA theory. So he's someone that I think everybody should know about. So Colonel John Boyd, B-O-Y-D, he was an Air Force fighter pilot, and he became very famous in the military circles and in business later on. And he taught aerial combat, like around the Korean War, and he was also responsible for helping to design some of the very famous jet fighters. And his nickname was actually 40-second Boyd, meaning the amount of time, 40 seconds. And they called him that because he had this bet that if he was in a dogfight position in the air, that if he was in front of an aircraft that was behind him that could kill him, within 40 seconds he could reverse the positions and take the other person out. And so he worked in an environment that was a very high risk environment. Like if you don't win, you're dead, right? You get blown out of the sky. Anyway, he came up with this theory called OODA, O-O-D-A, which stands for Observe, Orient, Decide, and Act. And what he talked about is that everybody, especially if you're up in the sky, but every other activity that you're doing, you are constantly in this little execution loop. We're constantly observing and seeing what is going on, and not just with our eyes, with our ears, or with data, or any way that we get stuff in, and then we are orienting ourselves to all that data, trying to get some information from that, and then use that to make a decision, and then we have to act on the decision, right? And his idea was that you need to make a better quality decision faster than the other person, right, if you're going to survive, right? And so this is a thing that if you think about this, you see musicians doing this all the time, right? But one of the things my main point here is that the second step in that thing, the first step in that the observing is the awareness part.
Yes.
So if you don't even have the awareness, then it's like it's all over already. Right.
You have then the DA theory, so you decide and then act.
Yes, yeah. I mean, it means that you are actually then making decisions without a whole lot of stuff that you actually needed, right, to make the better quality decision, right? Because you weren't even aware of it, right, in the first place. And you see this all the time, actually, even with musicians. Sometimes people are playing, and someone did something that was really cool, and someone just totally missed it. They didn't even hear it, right? Or someone actually made a mistake, and they didn't, something happened, and someone could have been there to help save them and say, ding, 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 hey, we're actually here, and they didn't do that, right? So, that awareness, so in jazz, we talk about people with big ears, not like Mickey Mouse, but it means, that they hear everything, right?
Yes.
And they're aware of everything. And so, yeah, that's to me is the most important thing, right? Is awareness, not just in business, but I mean also as individuals in everything that we do in relationships and so much more.
Yeah, I call it in the music thinking framework: listen, tune, play, and perform.
Right.
While listen goes through all of them. And that's what we're doing as musicians. We listen all the time in all these phases.
Yes.
So I like very much the 40-second Boyd
Yeah,
and the
yeah.
musicians that come together.
Well, it's an example also that, again, because we all tend to think that we are special, right? And that and in the end, really, regardless of what we do, whether we're fighter pilots or jazz musicians or business consultants or whatever, right? I mean, a lot of the things are the same. It's just that the domain and the discipline and the techniques are all obviously very specific, right? But the fundamental principles of the way that we execute, right, and the way that we make decisions, a lot of it's the same stuff, right? So that's an important thing because it means that you can learn from so many. There are so many opportunities to learn, right? And even if you go out in nature, and I wrote about this a little bit in my book, and you watch animals, how groups of animals do certain things together, the way they collaborate, it's incredible, right? And so, there's so many opportunities for us to learn to get better in terms of how we work together as people. And even if you're not in business, right? I mean, if you look at what's happening today with the pandemic, right? It's very much we're all in this together, right?
Yeah.
And so, we have to figure it out together, right? And so I think we're all very much aware of that now, probably more so than before.
Yeah, we're all performing every day.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Adrian, thank you very much for sharing all these analogies and already really bringing it together, all these patterns, and make a great synthesis out of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate this because listening is one of the top leadership skills, and I feel honored about this. It is my mission to find, create, and share inspirations for meaningful collaboration based on music analogies. If you want to support this, please subscribe to the podcast, give us a rating, or write a review on iTunes or Spotify. And more inspirations can be found on musicthinking.com. We have a blog, and you can download the Music Thinking Framework. And finally, I would love to hear your feedback. And if you need help with a business challenge, please reach out to me via email, podcast@musicthinking.com.